Welcome, everybody, to our June Relevance Researchers Network online seminar. Today, Ryoko Sasamoto is going to give us a presentation and lead the session. Ryoko is Associate Professor in Linguistics at Nara Women's University in Japan. Her research interests center around resemblance and the showing meaning continuum, with particular attention to how people communicate beyond verbal meaning. She's the author of Onomatopoeia and Relevance, Communication of Impressions via Sound with Palgrave in 2019, and is co-founder and co-organizer of this group, the Relevance Researchers Network. So without further ado, I will pass over to Ryoko. The
Okay,
floor is yours.
thank you, Kate. Hold on. Thank you, Kate. Let me just see if I remember how to do this. Sharing. Yes. Have I managed to share?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect. We're good
Okay,
to go.
great. So today I'm going to talk about the resemblance and multimodality. And well, before that, I have to say thank you everyone for coming. And this is a very sort of new-ish work. Well, I've been talking about resemblance for quite a while, but with this particular sort of approach is new, and I really would value your feedback on this. And I'm going to talk about these things, caricature and visual metaphor today. And don't worry, I'm not going to go too much on about Trump, but the reason for looking started to like reason why I started to look at this is they are perceptual, but are they? Is the big question. A caricature often departs sharply from subject's actual proportions. If you look at his face and his hands and head, he's got very small head with big mouth. But it is really recognized and interpreted as Donald Trump. Exaggeration and omission. There's no like fidelity seem to do the work. The same is true for the visual metaphor on the right. This melting ice cream earth shares some features with target and not others. So what guides the selection? The roundness and meltings are picked out, but taste or ingredients are not. Yet, this does not feel arbitrary, right? So these are the kind of issues. In both cases, resemblance is not a neutral inventory of shared features. Something is already at work determining which features count. So depending on what perceptual resemblance means, or really don't know, we don't actually even know what perceptual resemblance means. I just thought, okay, there is a bit of a gap there. So the question I want to ask is what role does a resemblance actually play in communication? The obvious answer is resemblance functions as evidence the audience uses to infer the communicator's intentions, not a measure of visual match. It's selective and inference-based. But before I can just say, yeah, this really is the case, I have to, what have I done? I can't see my slide anymore. What have I done there? Hold on. I want to see my slide. Can you see my slide still? Can you
Yes,
see?
I'm
Yes?
still.
Okay. Good. Okay, so obvious answer is like evidence, but before we can safely say this, there are a few things that we need to consider, like functions as evidence that I think something is wrong with this slide, so I'm going to move on to the next one. Okay, so today I'm going to start with interpretive versus perceptual resemblance to see if there's any room for discussion. And then I will look at two case studies. It's not even case study. I will just want to discuss two examples. One is visual metaphor. The other is the caricature. And I will discuss what my current thought on this. So in relevant theory, there has been substantial work done on interpretive resemblance. And it is commonly agreed that um, hold on. Yes. So before turning to perceptual resemblance, I'm gonna just go over what we mean by interpretive resemblance in relevance theory. So Sparrow and Wilson define interpretive resemblance as relation between thoughts or propositional forms. Two thoughts interpretively resemble each other to the extent that they share logical or contextual implications. This is a notion used to explain phenomena such as loose use, metaphor, irony, and many others, where an utterance does not have to reproduce a thought exactly in order to communicate successfully. 2 points are particularly important here. First, interpretive resemblance is graded rather than all or nothing, identical. In this in this sorry identical, right? Second, it does not share identity. So saying same thing. What matters is not really these two representations don't have to be complete correspondence, but they just have to share. There should be some overlap in terms of implications that are relevant in context. So I come back to this idea later because it raises an interesting question. If interpretive resemblance already works in this graded sense, then should we really think of perceptual resemblance as something fundamentally different? Relevance theorists also already appeal to perceptual resemblance in several domains, like Charles Forsville and Francis Cuyus looks at visual and multimodal metaphor as resemblance. And of course, Tim Wharton, he discussed natural evidence in relation to nonverbal communication in extensive way, which I have cited quite heavily in my previous work. And in my own work on onomatopoeia, I suggested the extending interpretive resemblance to perceptual resemblance and said things like onomatopoeia communicates via perceptual resemblance. That is what onomatopoeia shows is a representation that perceptually resembles the experience the speaker wishes to share. But looking back though, I realized that I never actually really defined what perceptual resemblance is. I basically simply assumed the notion was intuitive. I don't think I'm alone in that, but still that something needs to be done properly. Something needs to really sort of dissect it. And we need to look into this idea of interpretive resemblance. Okay. So the question is, what exactly is perceptual resemblance? So here is a quiet assumption still. Like across this body of literature, perceptual resemblance between perception and object is largely treated as given, something the audience simply sees prior to any pragmatic or inferential work. So this is a concept that is frequently used but rarely defined. So where does this intuition come from? Why do we think it is given? Why do we automatically equate perceptual resemblance with visual similarity? I think this idea has been inherited from several overlapping traditions, such as the one I listed on this slide appears in iconicity or picture theories, Gottman 1968, or caricature research. And of course, iconicity people have been talking about resemblance or perceived resemblance between form and meaning. And of course, there are different, like these three approaches I listed, well, there are so many more. They are different from each other in many respects, but they largely share the assumption that resemblance is grounded in perceptible properties that can, at least in principle, be identified and described objectively. The common assumption is that it's quite straightforward. The picture resembles its object because they share visible properties, like someone's face is triangle because their facial shape looks like triangle, for example. And that also extends to like color, spatial agreement, or even movement. The more properties they share, the greater the resemblance. This way of thinking underlies many theories of pictorial representations. And although these approaches pursue different questions, they seem to share conceptual resemblance. Like whether we're talking about icons, pictures, caricatures, or iconicity, resemblance is generally understood as something that are in perceptual features themselves. And what's interesting here, Hodgson Ferrara says the second issue relates to the prominence of perceptual resemblance without concurrently considering other kinds of resemblances, such as resemblances of relation or association. This really highlights our preconception of perceptual resemblance being about visual or anything perceptible. And up to this point, I've discussed the perceptual resemblance is simple visual similarity. But visual similarity immediately raises another question. Which similarity counts? Because if we look at this melting earth example, we immediately notice the roundness and melting. Those similarities seem relevant in this visual metaphor context, but we don't think about taste, we don't think about ingredients, we don't think about sweetness or nutritional value or how bad it would be to eat this before going to bed. I am actually quite hungry now, but anyway. But there are also properties of ice cream. The traditional view treats this distinction as self-evident, or at least they don't seem to concerned about it, as if the relevant similarities simply present themselves. But I don't think they do because someone, of course the speaker, has selected certain features, and the audience recognizes those features as the one that matters. So the crucial question becomes, what and who determines that selection? And once we ask the question, perceptual resemblance, this notion of perceptual resemblance begin to look less like objective inventory of shared visual properties, and more like something shaped by communicative expectations in a way. This is the point where I think relevance theory has something very important to contribute. So up to now, we've seen the interpretive resemblance is well defined in relevant theory. It's graded, selective, and inferential. We also saw that perceptual resemblance is less clear. It usually described in terms of shared perceptual features and often treated as something available prior to inference. That leaves us two questions. The first is perceptual resemblance really independent of interpretation? The second question is, what kind of evidence does it provide for communication? Is it genuine direct evidence or does it already involve interpretation? So the next part, I don't know if interpretation is the right word because interpretation is done by the audience and I was talking about speakers, but I'll come back to, I'll have to think about the terminology properly as well. So the next part of the talk addressed the first of these questions. Is perceptual resemblance already interpretive? The question we arrived at, does who decides which similarities matter, and perception and the relationship between perception and cognition has also been explored in cognitive science in the debate on cognitive penetrability. This debate asks how far cognition reaches into perception. We can distinguish three increasingly strong positions. At one end, this input selection end, cognition simply guides attention. So it's a feature first. And basically, yeah. But second, and in the middle, the salience weighting idea. This is where we think that, no, they think the cognition shapes perceptual salience. The third one is the strongest one, and cognition partly determines perceptual content itself. The second one, in other words, is basically the perceptual representation itself remains largely the same. So it's matter of perception, but its organization changes depending on what is salient, what is relevant. So I just wrote it relevance guided. The third one, content constitution idea, is quite strong, and in that they think that cognition partly determines the content of perception itself. So rather than I pay attention to the ears, but they say I literally perceive is different. So because of the cognitive penetration into perception, they see things differently. So perceptual representation contains different content because of beliefs, concept, expectation, and so on. And these are discussed in Pillage, can't pronounce, Macpherson, and so on. But anyway, I'm not getting too much into this because I just borrowed this framework as very helpful way to discuss what we do, what I want to discuss. But anyway, so I just introduced the three levels of cognitive penetrability. So I want to see what these penetrability levels imply for perceptual resemblance. So under the input selection, the first one, perceptual features are identified independently of relevance or cognition. Relevance only comes into play afterwards when those features are interpreted. This is essentially the traditional two-stage view. A second view is this salience weighting one. So here, I'd like to, I'm thinking this is probably where I would like to argue for. In this position, relevance already influences which perceptual features stand out. The perceptual input remains the same, but its organization changes, and some similarities become salient to the viewers, while others recede into the background. The third one is a very strong position of seeing perception as interpretation, where resemblance itself is no longer something given by perception. Rather, it is a constituted through relevance guided processing. On this view, perceptual resemblance becomes a special case of interpretive resemblance. So my proposal at the moment is the middle position. It preserves the distinction between perception and interpretation while recognizing the role relevance plays in structuring perceptual salience. Also, this allows us to explain why some perceptual similarities become communicatively significant while others do not. And that's without collapsing perceptual resemblance into interpretive resemblance. So I want to look at two examples with this idea. So two cases why am I looking at these cases? Because I want to explain which features get selected and why, and is salience determined by expected relevance? Again, terminology needs to be carefully considered. Or the salience is filtered afterwards, or does communicator's role in construction resemblance tell us anything about which position holds? So let's look at the ice cream example. So the first impression. So what is this image doing without any analysis? So we can see roundness and melting in ice cream cone. And roundness and melting are exactly the feature relevant to the intended interpretation. And selection is already point towards this particular interpretation or particular set of assumptions, or maybe not particular array of assumptions related to this particular image. Okay. And here, taste and ingredients, which are equally real properties of ice cream, are not even given a chance to be considered for interpreting this particular image. And this suggests that salient structure is set up from the start, not filtered afterwards. The question is resemblance determined by objectively shared features or by the contextual implications made accessible through relevance-guided interpretation? Let's consider what is being communicated. And so here, roundness probably communicates the wholeness and fragility of single bounded object of the earth. And this melting and dripping would give rise to assumptions related to heat, urgency, loss, and irreversibility. Can't even talk. Note to myself, don't put word which I can't pronounce on the slide. Anyway, so the vulnerability, heat, and urgency are weakly communicated in this sense because they are made manifest as impressions rather than determinately encoded. There's no single paraphrase covers the effect. This resemblance points towards a region of array of assumptions, not one proposition. The feature that gets selected are exactly those relevant to this intended interpretation: vulnerability, urgency, and loss. Taste and ingredients don't really feature, they never become candidates at all. This suggests salience is structured by expected interpretation from the outset, not filtered afterwards. And this supposed to be that perceptual and interpretive resemblance are not clearly separable. Also, the weak implication is a communicative payoff. This image conveys this array of weak assumptions, and this resemblance points towards this array of weakly communicate assumptions rather than single proposition. So that is the visual metaphor. Let's move on to Trump. Okay. So here we have exaggerated proportions, omitted details, and yet still recognizable, still evaluative. So what does this mean? Caricatures depart from subject actual proportions, yet it works. It resembles where visual matching, hold on, something go wrong here. Okay. Can you still see my slide? Okay.
Yes, we can still
Yeah.
see.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
great. Okay, thank you. So, okay, so caricatures depart from the, like in this case, Trump's actual proportions, but it works. And if resemblance or visual matching, they should fail, right? Because it's not, of course, it's not identical, but this one is not too distorted. But quite often caricatures are largely distorted and it's not visual matching, but it works. So this means exaggeration omissions are not failure of resemblance. Rather, they're selective resemblance, pushed to an extreme in a way. What is selected here, like distinctive nose, posture, expression, and mouth, big mouth, and small head, is there because it gives rise to appropriate effects, not because it is the most accurate feature. So not being perceptually faithful representation is not the absence of resemblance. It is evidence of which features were judged relevant enough to keep. So, as this implies, exaggeration omissions is selectively pushed to extreme, and features not just weighted, but actively distorted to make a point. So let's go back to the three positions again. Well, I don't even have to go back to all of them, but just want to look at the first two-stage view. As we just saw, it looks harder to explain these examples on one two-stage view. If it is right to say that features detection comes first, accurately independently of relevance, then inference operates over those detected features afterwards, they mean that resemblance is pre-given perceptually and interpretation is separate subsequent stage. However, as we saw, for example, in caricature, distortion is already given before interpretation. So does that mean that addressees would have to see through the distortion, recognize the resemblance, then interpret the distortion? I don't think that is plausible. Across both cases, caricature and cases of visual metaphor, first position is the weakest candidate. The harder, the more interesting question is where the line falls between 2 and 3, but this actually is for the cognitive scientist. I want to go back to the pragmatics. The summary so far. From the three positions and two cases we looked at, we saw that feature selections are guided by relevance expectations, and perceptual resemblance are not neutrally given. So to bridge this gap, what we notice is selection already operates in perceptual resemblance, and difference is one of degree, not of kind. So there are varying interpretive resemblance and perceptual resemblance have something similar, and they basically have varying amounts of inferential work. So because if selection is already operative in perceptual resemblance, then the difference between perceptual and interpretive resemblance is just a matter of degree, rather than they are different, right? So what I'd like to suggest is that perceptual and interpretive resemblance form a continuum where a resemblance falls on the continuum determines whether it functions as something shown or something inferred in communication. And this leads to the question of the directness of evidence. So, in relevance theory, it is explained that showing provides direct evidence. And perceptual resemblance has generally been treated as a case of showing or giving direct evidence. But visual metaphor and caricature suggest that perceptual resemblance already is selective and, in a way, interpretive. So therefore, the relation between perceptual resemblance and direct evidence is not so straightforward, I think. I might be wrong. But in relevant theory, um, showing provides direct evidence and meaning provides indirect, often verbal evidence. So previous accounts treat visual resemblance as direct on this basis, like I did with onomatopoeia. But if perceptual resemblance is already interpreted or organized by communicators, shaped by organized communicators' intentions and selections and constructions, then visual evidence is not really straightforwardly direct, is it? It's not same as showing your bandaged arm. There has been some inferential leap in this, in communicator's head. So the question is, does directness of evidence scale with where the resemblance falls on perceptual interpretive continuum? The more interpretive a resemblance is, the less direct the evidence. Can we say that? So here are examples of cases involving perceptual resemblance. Say onomatopoeia is verbal, but but that involves perceptual resemblance. Visual metaphor, as we saw, is resemblance, perceptual, but partially constructed. Partially shown, I mean, like visually accessible. Caricature is very much constructed by communicator, although similarity is still there, visually presented perceptually. And verbal metaphor, resemblance, fully inferred. I don't know if it's fully inferred. I really have to be very careful when I say stuff like that. Now, this is a tentative claim, and even within onomatopoeia, there are a level of abstractions. When we talk about bang, if someone says bang to describe noise, that is very much direct perceptual. There's no inferential leap, no interpretation involved. But say, what is a sit bang and that is gone. Quite old TV adverts, but the spray, cleaning spray, sit bang. And they say bang and that is gone, but I'm sure the spray doesn't make bang noise. So what they're saying is they're just basically saying the effect of the spray is such that the dirt um, it disappears immediately. Or so there's even within onomatopoeia, you can see how this some are purely appears at least appear purely perceptual, while other ones seem much closer to interpretive. So we really need to think how direct are they as evidence? Can we just simply say, oh, this is perceptual resemblance? Anyway, so discussion and conclusion. I think I'm finishing very, very soon because I really would like to get your feedback on this. So, resemblance function as selective evidence, like we saw, and these guide audience inferences. But previously, we split resemblance between interpretive resemblance and perceptual resemblance very casually. But as these examples show, visual metaphor, caricature, and even sit bang example, this distinction doesn't seem to hold up cleanly as I had thought in my onomatopoeia work. So moving forward, we really have to think, how does the position on the perceptual interpretive continuum affect the strength or determinacy of what is communicated and directness of the evidence? Can we say if there is a continuum, right? I keep saying continuum about everything. If we can say that there's a continuum from perceptual to interpretive resemblance, then can the continuum be formalized within existing relevant theoretic tools? Or do we need something else, something new? What are the implications of other multimodal phenomena? Like Kate suggested, like orchestra conductor. To what extent the conducting gestures and so on interpretive, but they are sometimes very perceptual as well. So how do we, or do we even need to distinguish these? And these are what I'd like to think further. But here I just stop now, and so it's shorter than I expected. But yeah, so this is what I am thinking at the moment, and I would welcome your feedback and input on this. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think the timing's actually perfect. Gives
Okay,
plenty
great.
of time for discussion, so don't need to
Shall
apologize
I
for that.
stop sharing? Okay, I should,
Um,
yeah,
Unless you want to go back to the slides,
yeah.
I'll open the floor to questions. Or shall I start with one? I'll start with one. Um, I think I've asked you this outside of this meeting.
Hmm.
I still, as somebody who doesn't work in this area, I'm still not entirely sure I understand the split between interpretive and perceptual, whether they are different things, whether one is within the other. If they're on a continuum, what would sit at each end of the continuum? What's kind of the prototypical perceptual and prototypical interpretive?
So most typical perceptual resemblance would be something like, I don't know, um, map. No, that's not much, sorry. Now, what am I talking about? So what would be most typical perceptual? Say you hear the noise like, then you say bang. So that's the similarity of this particular noise and saying bang. Interpretive resemblance, I think like translation is said to be interpretive resemblance or quotation. What else? Reporting. So seem to have range, but as I said, even within onomatopoeia, some are very perceptual. Like in Japanese, we have the like golo golo. Golo golo is onomatopoeia for something heavy rolling around. So if you drop the sack of potatoes and potatoes rolls out of the bag, you can say potatoes goro goro thing. Or you can say there's loads of like say, but you can also say, oh, these ideas are all over the place. Or this when you want to say that is not something special, you can say that is goro goro everywhere. So we're talking about ideas. So that's very much abstract. You're not talking about potatoes rolling around the floor. You're talking about ideas everywhere and everyone's saying the same thing. So that's very much more, very much very interpretive. I still we need to be careful. So again, do we say they are perceptual? In my onomatopoeia work, I just simply said perceptual. But really is my question.
Okay, Tim, you have your hand up.
Yes. So I'm. It's not. It's not. A, well, it is a question, but it's a question to myself as much as to everybody else as well. So, what your question, Kate, was what's the difference between interpretive and perceptual? And I think we need to get that absolutely straight. So, descriptive and interpretive are possible relations between thoughts, representations. So you can entertain a representation as descriptive, or you can entertain it as interpretive. And you can present, an utterance can be intended as descriptive or interpretive. Yeah. Now, so my question is, where does this perceptual resemblance, I think perceptual resemblance has to be some sort of subset of interpretive use. So it's not really so it's so perceptual resemblance is sort of subsumed by interpretive use. And I think it's important that we get that straight. So that was just something that occurred to me as you were talking, Kate. The question that I have, which is more related to the talk, to the sort of ideas in the talk, is that I was constantly thinking about how a lot of what you said about perceptual resemblance rang true of verbal metaphor as well. So, the question, what guides the selection of the perceptual properties, is exactly the same as what guides the selection of the properties of concepts, encyclopedic entries of concepts in metaphor. And I kept thinking about that, and also emergent properties as well. So the ice cream example, why do we discard certain properties of ice creams, is exactly the same as when we say Bill is a bulldozer. Why do we discard the fact that bulldozers are typically yellow or made of wrought iron or steel or whatever? So I think I think the work that you're doing, Ryoko, is actually much bigger than just work on those subset of things that you've looked at in some depth, so onomatopoeia and stuff like that. And the reason that that's very salient to me at the moment is that I'm working on a paper on metaphor with Ming Yang and Agnieszka Piskorska as well. So, and we're thinking about this kind of cross-modal thing and how it relates to metaphor. I mean, the one thing that I just want, I'm sorry that this is so rambling, but lots of things are occurring to me as I speak. The other thing is, another question that you asked was, what was it you said? What role does resemblance play? What role does the resemblance play? And of course, in many ways, it's not the resemblance that's the important thing. I mean, the actual resemblance between something, if it's, say, a picture, and what you intend, can actually be minimal. What's important is that you are presenting it as something that contains perceptual resemblance. And it's the fact that you're presenting it in that way, and that it's relevant as something that is perceptually resembling something else, that leads the sort of audience to infer what that resemblance is. I'm thinking of examples of sometimes. So I'm, as Ming Yang and others will know, I'm a kind of compulsive doodler. I'm always drawing faces, and sometimes I will draw just like 4 or 5 lines, the most minimal face, and it will immediately look like somebody. And even though it's a line drawing and it bears very little physical resemblance to a person, there is something of the essence of that person that is captured. And I mean, Picasso did this incredibly with like four or five a continual line suddenly becomes somebody or something. So the resemblance is kind of in the way the communicator presents it. I think that's probably the most garbled I've ever been, but I think there might be little things that are relevant now. I don't know if you have a response to that other than why don't you go back to bed, Tim?
No, thanks, Tim. It's really, really, really useful. Okay, so there's few things I had thoughts on. So you said perceptual resemblance is a subset of interpretive resemblance, which I partially agree, but I think what I'm thinking more about is related to what you were saying later. Like, so it's not, it's true, it's not the resemblance itself that is important. It's the fact that we are using it to communicate. It's the fact that humans have this capacity to recognize the resemblance and use it for communication. That is important. So, when two things resemble with each other, there are so many things that resemble with each other in the world. And if something resemble, but if they're not used to communicate, it doesn't really matter, right? A resemblance doesn't matter unless it is used and unless it is presented as such. So that's the two things. And also perceptual resemblance, I think my confusion is. So we present something as something that resemble, or present something by virtue of resemblance. So that is the speaker perceiving the similarity. And we use that to communicate. We use that as evidence for our intention, and we want the audience to recognize the similarity. And we want audience to recognize that I want them to think that it's similar. So whose perception are we talking when we talk about perceptual resemblance? And does it even matter? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No. So in the first case, we're talking about what the communicator sees as a resemblance.
Yeah.
But then, as you say, in the all important cases that we're interested in, where it's used in communication, we're thinking about ways that the speaker can convey that resemblance and use it for whatever reason they do.
Yeah.
I have so much that I want to say, but I will try and be a good chair and take the questions from the group. Amima, your hand's up next, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ryoko, for the talk. I have a very, very specific question about cultural, we can call it cultural resemblance in multimodal communication. So you focused on perceptual resemblance as evidence for guiding inference, while relevance theory also distinguishes interpretive resemblance between mental representations. So I was actually wondering whether there is room for a notion of culturally mediated interpretive resemblance, where what resembles one another are culturally shared representations or schemas rather than perceptual features. So I'm currently working on internet memes, where all the features that I can find are cultural, or maybe I'm focusing on them. So could this kind of cultural resemblance also function as inferential evidence in multimodal communication, like particularly in what I'm working on? That's the question. Where would this fall actually, under perceptual resemblance or interpretive resemblance, or it can be a totally different category?
Cultural resemblance. I have to say, I haven't thought about that. I think if it's me and Kate might have things to say, but I think cultural resemblance, they must be using something to convey what is shared within a particular culture, right?
Yes, true. I can give you an example. Like these days, we are watching the World Cup, and we have Mo Salah working for the Egyptian national team, and he scores. So, in some memes, they portray him as the only one dressing like a pharaoh, referring to the greatness of how he plays and so on. So, this is totally cultural. But I think this is somehow perceptual, interpretive, cultural resemblance because dressing in a pharaoh's outfit, well, resemblance does not resemble the outfit, or it's not a resemblance of the outfit itself. It's a resemblance of the greatness of pharaohs, and he's the only one who scores. So maybe this is some kind of cultural well, analogy. I can just call it. I don't want to overuse the word resemblance. And the specific memes that I'm working on currently are the ones generated or the ones that spread after the grand opening of the Egyptian Museum, where the wait was long, and with all Egyptians have been waiting for this grand opening. So there are some memes showing well, Egyptians in the old ancient Egypt, having ceremonies resembling the ceremonies we have here for weddings, nowadays weddings. So this is some kind of cultural resemblance. I think so. So my question is where this should fall under perceptual or interpretive resemblance, or this can be, well, this can be a subcategory of any of them, or it has to be looked at from a totally different perspective or under another category.
I don't know. I have to really see your example, but from what I understood, maybe I understood wrong, but if it sounds like they are using some sort of resemblance, whether be perceptual or interpretive, to communicate cultural assumptions. So can we say, I think the question now here is, can we talk about interpretation, perception on the same level on the same level as culture? Because when we talk about interpretation, when we talk about perception, that is what's happening at the utterance interpretation or actually perceiving. That's something that happens some personal level. But when we talk about culture per se, that probably is, I don't know, Dance Baba might say differently, but again, depends on how culture is defined. But in my initial reaction to initial thoughts is perhaps using either interpretive perceptual resemblance to convey cultural meaning.
I mean, from
Yeah.
my work on memes, and I've done a bit of work on sound memes as well recently, which are really interesting, where it's the sound that is kind of connecting things, different meme tokens together. I think maybe one of the ways of approaching this from Relevance theory is thinking about it is, as Ryoko said, cultural assumptions are contextual assumptions. They're type of assumptions that we hold, right? They're just cultural specific ones. And so they can feed into the interpretation. And so if a meme is playing on those, then it's depending for its interpretation on people recognizing and sharing those assumptions. And they just happen to be based on cultural things. That would be my, from what I've thought about with memes, I think. Min Yang, you have your hand up.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure whether this is like a proper question. It's more like something that your presentation sort of reminds me of, especially something I've been doing a bit of reading recently, and I think that might be interesting for the current discussion. So first off, I really like the idea that you said that selection is involved on both ends, and then there is the like resemblance appears to have a slightly different relationship between visual metaphors and character. So my first point was actually partially echoing what Tim mentioned about the doodling thing. Because when you were talking about the character, that immediately reminds me of a very specific time frame during the ERP, the event related potential, which originally people thought that was the face detector, but then they later figured out it was actually part of a much larger processing framework. And the basic idea is that people tend to detect things that they are more familiar with. And then face, evolutionary speaking, is something that's usually considered as very highly relevant. So people tend to see faces, even in very simple sketches, like the kind of doodles Tim did. I think the interesting thing with character is that first off, the detection of facial features is already there, like very early on in the processing. But at the same time, I think there might be some sort of constraint of context being here, because when you think of where you might be finding the character, it's almost like people have something to expect when they're looking at the character, and that might also influence which specific features they're going to pick out, and then from there, the readers would construct the perceptual resemblance, and then they'll realize, oh, this is a character of Donald Trump, despite the fact that it's not necessarily a perfect match of his facial features. So I found that very interesting, because the detection of faces is it's almost like a built-in feature for humans, at least, to recognize. And also on the relevant note, the face detector, or that very specific window, which by the way, it's around 170 milliseconds after the onset of the stimuli, is also a very important notion in the predictive processing framework. And the main idea of the predictive processing model is that our brain is constantly making predictions of the environment, of the world. And when we see something that goes against our prediction, it almost automatically attract attention. So in that case, we could perhaps interpret that as a suddenly kind of like a peak of relevance. So it draws your attention to some specific aspect of that character of the picture, which later on will prime or influence further processing. So that's the first thing about character. And then in terms of visual metaphor, I agree with Tim that in a sense, it works in a very, well, at least part of the processing of visual metaphor works in very similar way as how verbal metaphors works. But I would say that happens much later in the processing. The early stages would probably be the processing of the image itself. So in the ice cream example, early processing would be detecting which part of that picture is most interesting or most salient, or perhaps most novel, something we're not necessarily expecting. We usually don't expect an ice cream ball to look like an earth. So that might be something that appears to be more relevant, or at least more unexpected. And then later on in the processing, we do the integration of semantic features or linguistic features coming later. And by that point, I would agree that visual metaphors works in very similar way as how verbal metaphors work. But anyways, I'm not sure how much of what I said makes sense, but like I said, it's not necessarily a question for Ryoko, but it's something I find extremely interesting, and I'm still trying to tie in with my current work, but at the same time realize that visual processing appears to be much more complicated than say audio processing. But it's interesting to see if similar framework will work for other modalities. So yeah, thank you for the presentation. I really liked it.
Thank you. Yeah, the face detection is interesting because when I did the eye tracking work for TV programs, most of the time the eyes were on the faces of those who are on TV. So we seem to really, as viewers or as human beings, yeah, we always just go for someone's face. I think that's kind of human nature, really. But yeah, I don't know if about the sort of you kind of so you do you mean like when they interpret visual metaphor, there's a time sort of stages of processing, or is that what you mean?
Yes, kind of. I mean, I suppose the processing, very similar things happening to all sorts of input processing. So in terms of visual input, the first thing that our brain tend to notice is something that's has nothing to do with any sort of linguistic interpretation. So things like the shape, the boundary lines, and colors, different hues, that sort of thing. But that's very early on, and then there is a stage where you have the integration of those very early features from the image, which has nothing to do with any sort of conceptual information. And then there is a later stage where those very early features would be integrated with conceptual representation, so to speak. And also it would be integrated with emotion-related information. So people would have a specific emotional reaction to certain features. So for example, if you show them something, a picture of a brutal car crash, people would have emotional responses to that. But the actual interpretation of this is a car crash, this is a violent picture, happens fairly late in the whole processing. The early stage of processing would be detecting the visual features of that picture. So in a sense, it's non-judgmental. We're not making any sort of interpretation in the early stage. Interpretation came much later in a neuroscientific sense. It's usually after 400 milliseconds. So yeah, the whole study of event-related potential using the EEG. So you have pretty much like a timeline, and then you see the waves of what the brain is doing at each stage.
Interesting. Thank you.
Would you want to come back on that or a separate question?
Yeah, it was just to add to that. Yes, so there's this time related stuff is something that Mengyang and I are really interested in at the moment, with regards the interpretation of prosody, particularly emotional prosody. So there are some at the event that we organized in Geneva, there was a talk where somebody had actually provided a timeline of how people assess various aspects of affect, or how people evaluate the various aspects of affective prosody from others. But and we're talking about audio, of course, but visually there's this phenomenon which is called pareidolia or pareidolia, which is this tendency which is part of a broader human tendency we have, which I think is called apophenia, which is where we're sort of hardwired to see, immediately detect meaningful things, whether they be audio or visual, when they aren't really there. so pareidolia in particular is this tendency that humans have to see faces in everything. So, that people, somebody, the latest photographs from the surface of the moon, and everybody was saying, God, there's a face. It must have been made by early moon settlers or something like that. And of course, it's just our propensity to see things. So I think this point about the timeline is really interesting because we're hardwired to do certain things, and we've evolved the ability to reflect on them and dismiss them as, errors, as it were. And that must have some, in terms of visual resemblance, that must have some role to play. I don't know what role it has, but it's an interesting insight from the neuro people about how vision works and how the perception of resemblance, if you like, works. That was all I had to add.
Can I just jump in with a very quick comment concerning the face thing? Is that once you've seen the character as Donald Trump, you can't unsee it. It's there, regardless of how well. I mean, I'm not sure what happens if you see that picture again in 2 years' time, but if it's just a couple of days, I don't suppose that interpretation is going to change. If you see a face, you can't unsee the face. If you see the face as someone, arguably it's quite difficult to unsee that face as someone. I'm not sure whether that would be useful. It's just something that jumps to mind as Tim was speaking.
I think what you mean there is, once you recognize the resemblance, then what I'm interested in is how it is used in communication, whether that matters. I know it does matter. These are the level I'm at the moment. But I just also noticed that Dana has made a few suggestions there, so I will look into this. Thanks. And this comment, con is significant as well. Yeah. Yeah, so thanks, Dana, for making a few suggestions there. Thanks. As I said, this is still very early stage, and I'm just trying to build from my onomatopoeia work into a bigger, sort of more different types of phenomena as well. And other things I was also working on is like naming or other sort of, so category extensions. And there's so many things that seem to work in a similar manner. And if I kept talking about perceptual resemblance, and then it really will not hold. So I'm just trying to see exactly where they're at and how I can develop from there. Anyway.
Thank you. I think you've raised a lot of interesting questions that we're all thinking about now. And we've come up to the hour point now, so we'll stop grilling you and let you relax into your evening. And the rest of us can relax into whatever part of the day we are in at the moment, whatever extremes of weather we are experiencing. So thank you once again for your presentation. We don't have any more seminars planned. We usually take a break over July and August, but we'd like to restart again in September. So if anybody would like to lead a session, please do get in touch and we can get you onto the schedule. Otherwise, we'll wish you all a happy rest of your day and hope to see some of you soon.
Happy summer holidays. Yeah. Bye-bye.